The morning I finally followed Oren, the frost was still on the heather. I had asked him before, standing in the yard of the eastern keep, watching the old gray wolf pad toward the tree line with that unhurried certainty that always made me feel like a fool for questioning him. I had said it aloud like a king addressing a subject. "Where are you going?" Oren had glanced back once. Then he disappeared into the bracken without a sound, and 12 other wolves had filed after him like wool pulled through a needle. That was the third morning in a row. By my count, it had been happening for nearly 2 years. I want to be clear, I was not a man who lost sleep over the habits of his pack. Havenmore's wolves were the oldest bond in the kingdom. They moved according to instinct, not instruction, and half the time their instinct was sharper than anything my council produced. If they chose to spend their evenings somewhere beyond the keep's stone walls, it was their right. I trusted them. That trust was mutual, and that mutuality was the whole foundation of everything I had built. But 2 years and no explanation, and my most senior wolf, Oren, who had tracked 3 wars with me and never once chosen comfort over duty, leaving at dusk and returning at dawn, smelling of lavender and river clay and something I could not name, something that sat behind my breastbone like a question I kept forgetting to ask. My captain Drev had tried to track them. He was the finest tracker in the kingdom. He'd come back twice with nothing, and once with a faint headache he couldn't explain, and a look on his face that suggested he had seen something puzzling but didn't know how to say so. I had not pressed him. Drev was not a man who withheld information from his king. He simply didn't have it. So at first light of harvest gathering morning, when I heard the familiar soft percussion of paws on the keep's worn stones, and watched Oren lead his silent column toward the east, I did what I should have done 2 years ago. I pulled on my plainest cloak and I followed. Havenmore at dawn in late autumn is a flat gray miracle. The heather doesn't know it's supposed to look dead in October. It keeps its low purple even through frost, and the light when it comes angles across the rolling land in long amber sheets that turn the bracken to hammered gold. I grew up watching that light from the keep's tower. After 34 years, it still stopped me briefly every time. Oren didn't wait for me, but he didn't lose me either. Wolves don't usually accommodate kings who have decided to follow them, but Oren had always been something slightly other than an ordinary wolf. He kept a pace I could match. Not easy, not difficult. As if he'd known I was coming and had already decided how he felt about it. We walked east for half an hour. The land dipped toward the old Havenmore forest, not the great black wood to the north, but the smaller inland growth, a spread of oak and rowan and silver birch that had been old when my grandfather was young. At the forest's edge, where the trees gave way to a clearing of thick grass and a low stone wall, there was a cottage. I had known it was there. Every piece of land in Havenmore was mine to know. I had simply never had occasion to visit it. The eastern boundary cottages were small holdings, herbalists and beekeepers mostly, and they were managed by the village elder, not by me directly. I paid my attentions to the kingdom, not to every stone in it. I stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked. 7 wolves were asleep in the herb garden. Not 7 wild wolves, my wolves. I knew them by their markings and their sizes. Oren's second, a dark female named Bray, was curled around a stone planter. 2 young males I'd been training since they were pups were sprawled on either side of the garden's entrance gate, which was not latched, and which they had presumably nosed open sometime before dawn. The others were distributed at irregular intervals between the raised herb beds, each one asleep with the particular abandonment of a creature that has found, after a long time of searching, exactly where it belongs. The herb garden was clearly not built with 7 wolves in mind. It was a modest space, lovingly maintained. I could see that even from 20 yards away. The beds were laid out in careful rows, labeled with small stakes, and the paths between them were swept clean. The lavender was still going, which was unusual this late in the season. It smelled, even from here, of there it was. Lavender and river clay and that other thing I couldn't name. A woman came out of the cottage. She was perhaps 28, perhaps 30. It was difficult to say, partly because her face was the kind of face that doesn't announce its age, and partly because she was looking down at something in her hands rather than up at anything in the world. She had a basket over one arm and a pair of small cutting shears in her other hand, and she was wearing a work dress in a pale brown, so faded it was nearly cream, with her sleeves pushed up past her elbows despite the cold. She stepped off the cottage's low stone step, and directly into the herb garden without looking up. She stepped over Oren's second without breaking stride. She edged around one of the young males, setting her basket down briefly to rebalance, then picked it up again and kept moving down the nearest herb row with the concentrated focus of someone who had a mental list and intended to complete it. I realized I had stopped breathing. She knew they were there, the wolves, of course she knew. She'd been stepping around them with the ease of long practice, the way you move around furniture in your own home. But she wasn't reaching to pet them or speaking to them. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply there with them, the way the lavender was simply there and the stone wall was simply there, part of the same morning. Then she reached the end of the row, turned back and saw me. She had gray eyes. This is not an unusual feature in Havenmore, where half the kingdom has eyes in some shade of gray or green. But there was a particular quality to hers, a directness, an unperturbed steadiness, that made me feel, for a breath, that I was the one being assessed. She said, "Those are your wolves." Not a question, not an accusation. An observation, calmly delivered, in the voice of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had mildly occupied them. "They are," I said. "I've been calling them the yard wolves," she said. "The gray one I've been calling Old Patience." She looked at Oren, who was threading his way between the herb beds toward her with his tail at a dignified angle. "He's clearly much older than I'd thought. King's wolves live longer, don't they?" "They do," I said. "I've been feeding them." She said this without apology or particular anxiety, as if informing me of a relevant practical detail. "I didn't know they had an owner. They came the first time looking hungry, and after that they kept coming back." "They're not hungry," I said. "They have full provisions at the keep." She considered this. "Then they're coming for some other reason," she said, and looked at Old Patience, at Oren, with an expression I can only describe as fond and slightly bewildered, the way you look at a very old relative who has developed an inexplicable new hobby. I should have felt foolish. My wolves, the pride of Havenmore's royal line, had apparently been spending their evenings eating an herbalist's table scraps and sleeping in her lavender beds for the better part of 2 years, and she had simply assumed they were strays. I should have been embarrassed, at least. Drev would have been embarrassed. Instead, I felt something, a quiet thing, like a door somewhere in my chest, which I had believed to be simply a wall, opening a crack onto a room that had always been there. "I'm Aldrich," I said. She looked at me with those gray eyes. "I know who you are," she said. "You're the king." She said it the way she'd said everything else, simply, as a fact among other facts, in a world that contained lavender and river clay and royal wolves and kings standing at the edge of herb gardens at first light. "And you," I said. "Senna," she said. "I tend herbs, also apparently your wolves." I told myself I went back the next day because of the wolves. This was not entirely a lie. The wolves were still going. Oren and his company vanished every evening and returned every morning, and though I now knew where they were, the why of it still sat unresolved in me. Instinct, I had said to myself. Wolves went where the bond drew them, but the bond was supposed to draw them too well. To someone specific, someone the moon had set aside. I had not had a fated mate in 34 years. I had stopped expecting 1 year ago, quietly, without ceremony, the way you stop expecting a season to turn and simply learn to live in the one you have. So I went back because of the wolves. That was my reasoning, and I kept to it as I walked the east path in the early afternoon of gathering day, when I had 2 hours before I was needed at the hall. Senna was at the wall at the far edge of her property, repairing a section of loose stone. She had what appeared to be a systematic approach to it. She'd laid out the fallen stones in a line by size, which meant she was putting them back in a deliberate order. Oren was watching her with his head on his forepaws, giving her the benefit of the same grave attention he had given to 3 wars. "You don't have to do that yourself," I said. She looked up. She didn't seem surprised to see me, which I found something about it. "It's my wall," she said. "Who else would do it?" "I could send a mason." "I know how walls work," she said. She picked up the next stone in her line, a large, flat one, and fitted it into the gap with a practiced efficiency that suggested she had, in fact, done this before. "Is there something you needed, or are you here about the wolves again?" "I'm here to understand why they come," I said. She dusted her hands on her work dress and looked at Oren. "Old Patience," she said, which was apparently still his name, regardless of what I'd told her. Do you want to explain yourself to your king? Oren blinked at her slowly in the way wolves do when they are extremely comfortable and wish it to be known. He's not going to explain himself, I said. No, she agreed. He never does. She picked up the next stone. Have you considered that you're asking the wrong question, not why they come, but why they stay? I watched her fit the stone into place. What's the difference? Everything, she said, simply the way she said everything. Coming is instinct, staying is a choice. I thought about that for longer than I had thought about anything in recent memory. The harvest gathering is tonight, I said. You'll be there. I have a booth. Dried herbs, tinctures. She patted the wall, testing its stability. I'll be there until the bonfire, then I'll come home. The wolves will need feeding. They have food at the keep, I said. She gave me the look again, the one that was neither rude nor deferential, simply present, simply direct. Then why do they eat mine? I did not have an answer for that. I walked back to the keep with the smell of lavender at the back of my throat and that quiet thing in my chest open wider than it had been before. And I did not know what to call it, so I called it nothing and got ready for the gathering. Let me tell you about Ren. Ren had come to me 3 years ago during the aftermath of the Kelmark boundary dispute, not as a diplomatic arrangement, not as a ward in any formal sense, but because there had simply been no one else. Her family had been on the wrong side of a collapsing situation, and when the dust cleared, she was 5 years old and alone at the edge of a burned estate, and one of my men had brought her to me because he hadn't known what else to do, and I had looked at her and thought, neither do I, but here we are. She was 8 now, and she had not spoken a word in the 3 years I had known her, not one. The healers said it was not physical, her voice was there, intact. She simply hadn't used it. She communicated in other ways, looks of extraordinary precision, a particular short exhale that meant she was being patient with you, a way of tilting her head that conveyed more than most men managed with full sentences. She had opinions about everything. She expressed them without hesitation. She had simply elected not to speak. I had stopped pressuring her to about a year in. Her silence was not a problem she was asking me to solve. She came to every gathering. She liked the fire and the noise from a safe distance, and she liked the honey cakes, and she had a system for evaluating the presented goods at each merchant's booth that was so thorough it had once reduced a fabric seller to cheerful despair. I brought her every time, and every time at the end of the evening she found me by the fire and fell asleep against my arm on the bench, and I carried her home. Tonight was the same, except for 2 things. The first, my council had decided without asking me that the harvest gathering would be an appropriate occasion to present the kingdom's eligible women formally before the king, in the manner of the old choosing ceremony. I had not agreed to this. I had also not, apparently, successfully refused it. My steward Harridge had given me a look of gentle apology and explained that invitations had already gone out, and 7 women of standing from across Havonmore had already accepted, and it would be very awkward for everyone if I simply didn't participate. I had told him I would stand in the hall. I had not promised anything beyond that. The second thing was Ren. The Harvest Gathering Hall was the oldest building in Havonmore after the keep itself, broad and low-beamed, with a stone floor and a fire pit large enough to roast an ox in, and tables around the edges where merchants and craftspeople from all the border villages set out their autumn goods. It smelled of wood smoke and apples and the particular dry sweetness of cured things. I liked it. I had grown up in it. Every king of Havonmore had grown up in it, and you could feel that in the beams, something deep and continuous and unassuming. The 7 women my council had presented were arranged at one end of the hall. They were each fine in their own ways, well-dressed, composed, daughters of good families who had made the journey in good faith and deserved to be treated with courtesy. I was courteous. I shook hands. I asked the right questions. I listened to the right answers. I felt nothing particular which was not their fault and not mine, and which I had learned to accept without cruelty on either side. Ren stood at my left the entire time. She watched each woman come forward with the same evaluative calm she brought to fabric sellers and honey sellers and the question of which log to put on the fire. When each woman stepped back, Ren gave me a look. The look was not unkind. It was simply clear, not this one. The third woman tried to take her hand, gently and with the best intentions. Ren stepped sideways out of reach with a patience that I recognized as barely that. The 5th woman bent down and spoke to her in a high, sweet voice. Wren's exhale could have been heard across the hall. By the seventh, Harridge was looking at his boots. I was about to say something diplomatic to end the evening when Wren's hand found my sleeve. She was looking at the far end of the hall. I followed her gaze. Senna was at a table near the far wall, between a basket weaver and a man selling beeswax candles, with her dried bundles hung on a rack above the table and her tincture bottles arranged in a row below. She was in the same work dress, or one very like it, with her dark hair up and a few strands loose around her face. She was talking to an elderly woman who was holding up two bundles and apparently asking for guidance, and Senna was explaining something with her hands, turning one bundle to show the color. She had not looked up. She was not performing anything. She was simply at her table doing her work, in the same way she'd been stepping around wolves in her garden and fitting stones back into her wall. Wren let go of my sleeve and walked the length of the hall. I have replayed what happened next more times than I can count, and each time it is the same. Wren crossed the entire harvest hall, through the crowd, past the fire pit and the tables and the 7 women my council had arranged at one end of it. She walked with absolute certainty, the way wolves walk when they know. She went to Senna's table, and Senna looked up, and Senna smiled at her, not the high, sweet smile of someone performing gentleness at a child, but a real smile, a warm and ordinary one, the smile of someone who finds a small person walking up to them with clear intention to be both unexpected and entirely welcome. Senna crouched down to Wren's height. Wren looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Senna's hand in both of hers, the careful, deliberate grip of someone who has decided something. She opened her mouth. She said, "Mama." Not loudly, not theatrically. She said it the way you say a word you've been holding a long time, and now you're simply releasing it because you've arrived at the place where it belongs. The hall was not quiet when she said it. The hall was full of fire and talk and the 100 small sounds of a working autumn gathering, but somehow the word carried. The elderly woman with the herb bundles heard it. The basket weaver heard it. Harridge heard it from across the room, and I saw his head come up. I heard it standing at the other end of the hall, and my wrist blazed. Not a burn, not pain. Warmth, sudden and absolute, beginning at the mate mark I had carried for 34 years and spreading upward like light through a frosted window. I looked down at my own wrist. The old mark, the pale silver crescent that had been there since before I was king, before my father died, before I was anything in particular, was lit. Lit the way I had never seen it in 34 years. Alive. Senna was looking at Wren with an expression I cannot adequately describe. Tender, startled, not frightened. She said softly, "Hello, sweetheart." She said it to Wren, but her gray eyes moved up, past Wren's shoulder and found me across the hall. The length of the hall between us was perhaps 30 yards. I walked it. I want to tell you what I understood as I walked, because it came to me not as a revelation, but as a sequence of quiet fittings, like stones being replaced in a wall, each one finding its slot. 2 years of wolves. Oren, who had known me for 15 years and had never in that time gone anywhere without a reason, walking east every evening to a cottage at the forest's edge, leading the others. Coming back smelling of lavender and river clay and that thing I hadn't been able to name. The thing I could name now, standing in a harvest hall with my wrist blazing silver light. It smelled like home. It smelled like the specific warmth that the bond carries when it recognizes what it's been pointed at. My wolves had known for 2 years. Oren had been going to her cottage every evening for 2 years, not because he was hungry, not because she fed him, though she had fed him, because she was the kind of woman who noticed a hungry creature and did something about it, but because the bond had sent him. The bond had sent the whole pack quietly, while I wasn't paying attention, to the woman who was mine, to keep watch over her, to be near her, because the bond had understood what I had not yet let myself understand. She had named him Old Patience. She had named him that because he waited. Because he came every day and waited, and she didn't know why, and she fed him anyway and tended his old joints with her hands and her herbs, and he lay in her lavender and was content, and he waited. Oren wasn't waiting for her. He was waiting for me to arrive. Senna stood up from Wren's height as I reached the table. Wren had not let go of her hand. "Your wolves," Senna said. She was looking at my wrist at the light from the mark. Her own wrist, I looked. pale skin a faint silver crescent, and it was lit warm and steady, matching mine. 2 years, I said. 2 years, she agreed. She sounded like herself, that same unhurried, factual quality, slightly amazed at the facts but not destabilized by them. She looked down at Ren, then back at me. She said, "She hasn't spoken in 3 years," I said. "Not one word." Senna absorbed this. "She chose an important one to start with," she said. I looked at Ren, who was watching me with the particular precision of someone who has done an enormous thing and wants to know how it's landing. I crouched down. "You knew," I said to her. She gave me her short exhale, patient but barely. It meant, of course I knew. I've known. Keep up. "For how long?" I said. She thought about it. Then she held up 4 fingers. 4 months. She had known for 4 months, which meant she had been sitting on this knowledge for 4 months while I stood in the hall with 7 women who were not the woman and looked at my ward's clear-eyed response to each of them, and somehow had not managed to ask the right question. "She came to my booth in the summer," Senna said. "With a woman from the keep, her nurse, I think. She picked up a bundle of lavender and smelled it, and then she just looked at me for a very long time. I thought she might want a tincture for a headache." "She doesn't get headaches," I said. "I know that now," Senna said. There was warmth in her voice, a dry, fond warmth directed at Ren, who was pretending not to listen. "She came back 3 more times, just to look. I assumed she liked the herbs." "She might also like the herbs," I said. "She might," Senna agreed. The hall had begun to take notice. This was inevitable. I was the king. I was crouching at a herbalist's table with my wrist emitting silver light, and my ward was holding a stranger's hand and had apparently just spoken her first word in 3 years. These things get noticed. I could feel the change in the room's texture, the conversations interrupting themselves, the angle of people's attention shifting. I stood. I looked at Senna. "You're packless," I said. "That's what the village record says. No pack claim, no wolf form registered, no moon ties." "That's true," she said. "Will you tell me why?" She looked at me steadily. "My mother was from outside the kingdom. She never registered her blood ties here, and I inherited her standing. I've never shifted in front of anyone in Havenmore, so I have no formal record. It doesn't mean there's nothing there." She paused. "Old Patience knows," she said. "He slept near me every night for 2 years. If there were nothing, he'd have moved on." I thought of Oren. Oren, who had 3 wars worth of judgment and had never spent it carelessly. "He called you," I said. "My bond. He sent the pack to you because the bond already knew, and I was slow." "Busy," she said, not unkindly, with a faint lift of her mouth. "You're a king. You have things to attend to. I should have attended to this one sooner." "You're here now," she said. "This is the part I want to get right. I have seen choosings before. I have stood at formal ceremonies and watched kings claim their mates with great speeches and the full pageantry of a court arranged to witness it, and there is nothing wrong with that. It is dignified and appropriate, and the women who were claimed deserved every public acknowledgement they received. I have no argument with ceremony. But what happened in the Harvest Hall of Havenmore on that autumn evening was not, precisely, ceremony. I took Senna's free hand, the one that Ren wasn't holding, and turned it palm up and held my wrist against hers. The 2 marks aligned. The light between them was not dramatic, no burst, no sound, no theatrical flair. It was simply warm. Warm and steady and absolutely certain, the way a door closing on a cold night is certain. A small private completeness in the middle of a crowded hall. But the hall saw it. The hall saw my wrist. It saw hers. It saw the matched silver light between 2 people who had been circling each other for 2 years by wolf proxy and cottage visits and a small girl's patient, 4-month campaign of reconnaissance. And then the hall saw me look at Senna, at this woman who had named my oldest wolf Old Patience, and repaired her own walls, and told me I was asking the wrong question and smelled of lavender and river clay, and something I could now name, something the bond had been pointing at since before I understood what pointing was, and say, "Senna of the East Cottage, will you come with me?" Not, "Will you be my mate?" which is what the formal phrase was. "Will you come with me?" Because that was the truth of it. I wasn't claiming her. You don't claim something that has been yours from before you knew yourself. I was asking her to walk the road that had been waiting for both of us. She looked at me. She looked at Ren, who was watching her with enormous eyes and the expression of someone who has successfully completed a very large project. She looked at Oren, and I had not noticed him come in, which tells you everything about how thoroughly this woman had changed my attention. Somehow managed to enter the hall and was sitting 3 feet away, watching the proceedings with exactly the same expression Ren had. "Old patience," Senna said. Oren's tail moved once, dignified, certain. "Yes," she said to me. "All right." The women my council had arranged stood at the other end of the hall. I want to speak of them with the respect they deserve, because they were good women who had done nothing wrong. They had come in good faith and they had been courteous. But I also want to speak the truth of what I saw on their faces when they understood what had happened. It was not anger, not cruelty. It was something more complicated. The look of people who have spent their lives inside a particular understanding of how worth is measured, and have just seen that understanding demonstrated to be incomplete. Because Senna had not been presented, she had not been invited to be evaluated. She had been invited to sell herbs. She was packless by the record. She lived alone at the edge of the territory in a stone cottage, and stepped around wolves in her garden and repaired her own walls and had, apparently, been living as the mate of Havenmore's king for 2 years without either of them knowing it. The women bowed. It was the right thing to do and they did it correctly. But I am telling the true story. Some of them had at the beginning of the evening been told by someone, not cruelty, just idle assessment, that the East Cottage herbalist was here for commerce, not ceremony, and perhaps shouldn't be lingering near the formal end of the hall. The person who had said it was standing near the wall, and she did not bow. She went still instead, the way water goes still before it freezes. And then, carefully, she made the correct gesture of acknowledgement, because she was sensible, whatever else she was, and sensible people recognize when an era has ended. I noted it, I said nothing. There would be time, and I had learned that the most lasting lessons are the ones you don't deliver loudly. Harridge was smiling. He was trying not to smile, which was making it worse. Drev, who had spent the better part of 2 years being outwitted by wolves, had the expression of a man who understood everything and was very glad he was not the one who had to explain it. We stayed at the gathering until the bonfire reached its peak. Senna sold everything on her table in the first hour. There was, suddenly, a great deal of interest in the goods of the East Cottage herbalist, which she found both amusing and faintly suspicious. "Half of these people have walked past my table at every gathering for 3 years, she said to me, at a moment when Ren had taken herself to evaluate the honey cellar, and we had a brief window of relative privacy. "People adjust their attention when the circumstances change," I said. She said, in the tone that meant she was being generous about human nature. "The older woman over there, she was telling people I shouldn't be near the formal presentation area." "I know," I said. "You don't need to do anything about it," she said. She looked at the mark and understood. "That's enough." I looked at her. "You're remarkably uninterested in vindication," I said. "I'm interested in my herb garden," she said, "and in going home at a reasonable hour because old Patience will want his evening walk." She paused. "Though I imagine his evening walks are about to change." "They might become shorter," I said, "since he won't have to go as far." She turned to look at me with those gray eyes and that directness, and she said, "You're planning to be there often, then?" "I'm planning to be there always," I said, "if that's acceptable." She considered it in the same way she considered everything, not performing uncertainty, just actually thinking. Then she said, "You'll have to fix the east wing of the wall. The part I did today was fine, but there's another section that needs stone setting, and I can't reach the top course." "I can reach the top course," I said. "Good," she said, "then yes." When the bonfire reached its peak, I went to find Ren. She was at the edge of the fire's warmth, sitting on a low bench with both hands around a cup of hot cider, watching the flames with the focused attention she brought to all things she considered worth her time. She heard me coming, she always did, and shifted to make room without looking up. I sat beside her. Senna came and sat on her other side, and Ren looked at the two of us flanking her with the expression of a general who has successfully concluded a campaign. "Was this your plan?" I asked her. She gave me the look. The one that didn't say yes, because yes was insufficient. The one that said, "I identified the problem, I identified the solution, I executed the solution, and I have been waiting for you to catch up." Since the summer, I said. Her exhale was patient, barely. Senna laughed, a quiet, real laugh to herself rather than to either of us, the laugh of someone who finds the world genuinely funny and doesn't mind saying so. She put her arm around Ren's shoulders, and Ren, who had stepped sideways out of reach of 5 women this evening, leaned in, unhesitatingly the way you lean into something you already know. I looked at the two of them in the firelight. I thought about Oren, walking east through the frost every morning for 2 years. I thought about Senna in her garden, stepping around wolves she had named and fed and wondered at, not knowing whose they were, only knowing they kept coming back. I thought about the bond, that old silver crescent on my wrist, present since before I was a king, patient since before I understood patience, and how it had done, quietly and without my participation, exactly what it was supposed to do. It had sent the wolves ahead. It had sent Ren in her way. It had arranged this in the background of 2 years of my life, and it had waited, and when I finally arrived at a cottage at first light with my oldest wolf leading me through the frost, it had simply let me see what had always been there. I am a man who trusts instinct. It occurred to me, sitting by that fire with the mark still warm on my wrist and the smell of lavender under everything, that I had been trusting it all along. I simply hadn't known where it was taking me. Ren, I said, is there anything you want to tell me since you've started? She looked up at me, a long look. Then, with tremendous deliberateness, like someone choosing the right stone for the right gap in the wall. I knew. That was all, it was enough. We walked home at the bonfire's falling edge, the 3 of us, and Oren, who had appointed himself escort without being asked. Ren was between us and asleep on her feet within 10 minutes, which meant I carried her the last half of the way, and Senna walked beside me with her empty basket over one arm and the unsold tinctures in a small crate she had refused to let me take from her because, she said, she could manage her own crate. She was right, she could. At the cottage gate she stopped and said, I'll make the east room ready tomorrow. The east room, I said. It has 2 windows, she said. She'll like it better than the south. More light in the morning. I thought about telling her that she didn't need to rearrange her home for a child who had not yet formally been offered a room, that we hadn't discussed arrangements, that there was a great deal still to talk about between a king and a woman who had just agreed to come with him. I thought about saying all of that. Instead, I said, she'll like it better with lavender on the sill. I have lavender, she said. I know, I said. I've smelled it for 2 years. She looked at me, and then she smiled. Not the warm, practical smile she'd turned on Ren, not the dry, amused look she'd given the business of the evening, but something quieter and more particular, something that was only for this moment and no other, standing at a cottage gate in the cooling dark with a sleeping child between us and an old gray wolf sitting at our feet. Good night, my king, she said. Good night, Senna, I said. I walked back to the keep with Ren's weight in my arms and the warmth steady on my wrist and the smell of lavender carrying all the way to the tree line. Behind me in the cottage, a light came on in the east room window. I did not need to look back to know it was there. I could feel it the way you feel a fire when you've been cold a long time, not dramatically, not with any great announcement. Just warmth and the understanding that it has always been there and you have finally stopped walking away from it. Oren at my heel made a sound. Low and quiet, a wolf's version of satisfaction deep in the chest. He had been making that walk for 2 years. His work at last was done.